Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So hopefully everybody's turned their problem sets in. Still have a few minutes if you haven't, but we'd like to get those turned in. So you may recall that last time we met, which was a week ago, we were talking about we were talking about high-tech industries and strategic trade theory. So those were trade policies that are typically used by developed countries to promote their exports. Obviously, most high-tech products and services are generated in developed countries, and global duopolies, in our example of Airbus and Boeing, are also typically products that are produced in developed countries. Today, we want to sort of switch our focus a little bit and think a little bit about the kind of trade policies that developing countries have used over the years. And one of the things that we'll see is that there's actually been a big shift in the types of policies that developing countries have used, sort of pre the middle of the 1980s and post that period of time. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind when we talk about trade for developing countries. First is trade in terms of either exports or imports is quite important for most developing countries. On average, for all developing countries, imports and exports account for about 35% of GDP. For developed countries, that number is only about 20%. So again, developing countries in general have a much higher international trade component to their economies than do developed countries. The second thing that's important to recognize is that compared to total world trade, the developing world itself owns about a third of those total exports, which is a disproportionate share compared to their size of world GDP. So trade is indeed important for developing countries. Give me your problem set. Got a problem set? Oh, okay. You've already turned yours in. Okay. So we have to recognize, however, that trade is not in and of itself a goal, either for developed countries or developing countries. Trade just happens to be one part of economic activity. And typically what the goal of any government is, or any country is, with respect to economic activity, is how fast does that economy grow over time? Are we growing faster or slower than our population growth, which would suggest that our income per worker or income per capita would be rising or falling. So trade may be a component of how fast an economy can grow over time, but the real emphasis is on economic development or economic growth. And so what we need to ask ourselves then is what role does trade, and therefore trade policies, play in a broader context of economic development? Now, when we think about developing countries in general, their comparative advantage generally falls into one of three areas. They typically have land, often in a tropical climate, which means that they have a comparative advantage in the kinds of things that would grow in that kind of environment. They also have various natural resources. Developing countries actually cover most of the ground of the world, and so they have lots of kind of deposits of various natural resources under the ground. So we've got things like all sorts of different types of minerals and ores, as well as oil. These natural resources, though, may also be things like stands of timber or other types of lumber. And they also typically have fairly large labor-abundant workforces, so that they can also have an advantage in low-skilled labor. Okay, so if these are what their comparative advantages are in, then what we should typically see the exports from developing countries would primarily be in foods, fuels, crude oil, other primary products. So remember, a primary product is something that has no processing done to it. So it could be iron ore or copper ore or other types of things like raw timber, or things that are relatively low-skilled but labor-intensive manufactured goods. So these are the types of things that we should see developing countries exporting. Now, remember, the goal here is economic growth. And so trade policy becomes a policy that presumably would try to mesh with that goal of having faster economic growth. So there are roughly four types of trade policies that developing countries can adopt. The first is, we know what our comparative advantages are. Let's go with our Ricardian model or Heckscher-Ohlin model or whichever model of comparative advantage you want to use, and that's what we'll do. So we'll play to our comparative advantages, and what we'll be exporting is primarily food, fuels, and primary products, and perhaps low-skilled, labor-intensive manufactured goods. But we're just going to use normal supply and demand, free trade, to take care of that. The second choice that we have is to say, okay, we know that we have a comparative advantage in these areas, but we want to try to not only use that comparative advantage, we actually also want to exploit that comparative advantage. That is, we want to find some way of adopting a trade policy that's going to help us to boost over and above what a free trade comparative advantage might be. Now, in order to do that, we need to raise the world price, right? That's how we would improve our terms of trade. So there are a number of things that we could do to improve our terms of trade. One might be, we could form an international or localized cartel. We could, if we have relatively few producers of a product, band together and try to exercise some monopoly power. So OPEC, of course, is the most obvious example of this, right? The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, nobody questions that the OPEC countries have a comparative advantage in oil, right? They're sitting on lots more dead dinosaurs than the rest of us. And so they can get the oil out, they can export it, we know they've got that comparative advantage. But by forming that cartel and acting with more market power, they can actually drive up the world price. They do that, of course, by limiting the total volume of exports. Now, a second way of doing this is through something that we talked about not too long ago, an export tax. Remember, if you put a tax on something, you're going to do less of it. So if you put a tax on oil, which by the way the OPEC countries generally do, you're going to get less domestic production, which means less exports, which will drive up the world price. Now, it turns out that this option is not widely available for most developing countries. It works reasonably well within oil because most of the oil-producing and exporting countries recognize that it's in their best interest to follow the lead of Saudi Arabia and a few other very large producers. So you've got a limited number of producers that are going to do this. Now, a number of years ago, Brazil and Colombia tried to put together a cartel of coffee producers. Unfortunately, if you've been to Starbucks and taken a look at all the different kinds of beans that they have, coffee grows everywhere in the world, just about everywhere in the world, especially in the tropic zone. So you've got many, many more countries that are involved in the production of coffee beans. So it's much harder to organize a large group of people than it is a small group of people. Does it sound like the politics of trade policy? So again, that's an approach that countries can follow. Notice that both of these approaches are still based on the notion of we know what our comparative advantage is and we're going to exploit it. A third trade policy that we can do is to recognize that we need to develop industries to service the domestic market. And the way that this argument actually developed was to say countries that have grown rapidly, and the developing countries could look at the developed world and see all of those countries. And one of the big differences you would see between the high-income countries and the low-income countries, all the high-income countries had big manufacturing sectors. This was particularly true when you were looking at the global situation back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So the idea that that was formed is, well, what if, as a developing country, we use trade policy in a way to limit imports of manufactured goods, develop our own domestic industry, then now we'll have manufacturing activity, and that should propel us through faster economic growth and allow us to raise our income per person standards. So that was one idea. A second idea was, no, let's not limit our import side. Why don't we promote our export side? So on the export side, again, you still need to do the same thing. You want to have a trade policy that's going to foster the development of presumably new industries outside of those food, fuels, and primary products, but to try to develop and foster new manufacturing industries, typically, that again would generate a manufacturing base within the country, help not only on the trade side, but also on the economic development side. Various developing countries around the world over the years have adopted one or more of these approaches, have switched from one to another, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. Now, we already know, because we've already talked about this, that if you were going to have a government trade policy, from a theoretical perspective, it only makes sense to have that trade policy if there's some sort of domestic market failure. And one of the things that we know about developing countries is markets work much less efficiently in developing countries than they do in developed countries. And in fact, many developing countries don't have what we would consider as really fluid markets in lots of goods and services, and in particular, don't have well-developed markets for inputs, things like electricity or labor or capital or other types of things. In particular, two markets that seem to work much less efficiently in most developing countries are capital or financial markets and labor markets. So those kinds of markets suggest that it would be difficult to raise capital to actually start a new business under what we would think of as sort of free trade or free enterprise. And difficult labor or inefficient labor markets means that it's difficult to move skilled workers from one area to another. We've got expanding industries and contracting industries. How do we efficiently signal to workers which industries to move to? So these would both be justifications for some involvement from government policy. Now we know the first best solution would be to attack these problems directly, right? Fix the capital markets, fix the labor markets. Much harder to do than it sounds. Or a second best policy might actually be a trade policy. Now, again, the key here that we need to keep reminding ourselves about when we think about trade policy in developing countries, trade is not the primary goal. The primary goal is faster economic growth so that the low-income countries can become middle-income countries and eventually become high-income countries. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when the leaders of many of the developing countries look around the world in the first half of the last century, one of the things that they noticed is all the high-income countries had strong manufacturing sectors. So the key was not to follow the first two of those policy options, that is, let's just go with our natural comparative advantage in land and natural resources and labor abundancy, but let's try to figure out how we can create a strong manufacturing sector. In the 1940s, actually going back to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in particular, but actually through the 1960s and the 1970s, the first sort of policy goal was that third policy option that we talked about earlier. That is there a way in which we can limit the amount of manufactured imports into the country in a way that would raise a wall and allow a strong domestic manufacturing sector to develop? So that was the goal. This is what's sometimes known as import substitution industrialization, right? So we're going to have domestic industrialization, production of manufactured goods, that would substitute for importing manufactured goods. Now, there was a particular reason that import substitution industrialization took hold. What was very well recognized is that from the period of roughly 1850 to roughly 1950, the terms of trade for developing countries got worse and worse. Now remember, for the developing countries, their terms of trade, their primary exports were food, fuels, other primary products, and some labor-intensive manufactured goods, but primarily food, fuels, and primary products. And the prices of those types of goods relative to manufactured goods continued to decline, on average for 100 years. So it's pretty easy to see, right? If I'm taking advantage of my comparative advantage, trying to exploit my comparative advantage, but my terms of trade are working against me, I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do, but I'm always climbing uphill. So rather than continue to import increasingly expensive, from a terms of trade perspective, manufactured goods, why don't we make them here? We can figure out how to make this stuff here. There's lots of manufactured goods that are not technologically sophisticated. So that's what was looked at. So this terms of trade argument was the overwhelming economic argument for import substituting industrialization. Now, there were a number of things that went into this. One was there was a general notion that developing countries could not compete in the global marketplace for manufactured goods. The developed countries already had a head start, right? They were already manufacturing goods, right? England had been manufacturing manufactured goods or producing manufactured goods since 1750s. And so how would a brand new developing country, think Latin America or Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, how would those countries ever be able to sort of leapfrog up and be able to compete with Europe or the United States or Japan in the post-World War II period? So just from a competitive perspective, there was lots of sort of self-esteem issues, if you will, to use the modern parlance. The second issue was many developing country leaders actually believed that the world trading system was rigged against them. And when I mean rigged against them, I actually mean that in a pejorative way. They actually believed that the developed countries controlled the rules of the game, the organization that was there in place before the World Trade Organization, that they controlled the rules of the game in such a way that they weren't going to allow developing countries to effectively compete. Right? Because what happens if you let somebody compete? Drives down the price, you might lose jobs, and your manufacturing sector might become hollowed out. So that was part of the belief of developing country leaders. So we can't compete because they've got such a huge head start, the developed countries do, and they're rigging the rules against us in any event. Now, some of this, of course, fit very nicely into political biases that existed. So remember, a lot of developing countries were also colonies of European countries in particular. And when those countries started to gain their independence, one of the things that they wanted was a real arm's length relationship with their former colonial masters. So a lot of in African and Asian countries, once they sort of gained their own independence, decided that they did not want to actually follow the kind of economic theories on international trade that have been developed primarily by Europeans and Americans. I mean, remember, David Ricardo, an Englishman, Eli Heckscher, I don't know what Heckscher was. Bertrand Nolan was Swedish. But most trade theory had actually, up until that point, always been done by Europeans or North Americans. So the developing countries kind of wanted to get away from this. Now, if you think about import substituting industrialization, you'll notice that from the country's perspective, it actually is relying, and to some extent, on the infant industry argument. That we can compete eventually, that is, we can develop a strong manufacturing sector, which will help our pace of economic growth eventually, but because of domestic market failures, whether it's in the capital or financial markets, or it's in the labor markets, or it's this head start of the developed countries, or the rules of the game have been rigged against us, or whatever, but we've got to get started with that industry. And so we can use that infant industry argument for temporary trade protection, allow us to build that industry up, and then once we have built the industry up, we can get rid of that trade protection and then compete on a level playing field. Now, we've talked about infant industry argument before, so some of this we can go through pretty quickly. We talked earlier when we discussed the infant industry argument that it's basically an argument about a comparative disadvantage now, but a comparative advantage in the future. In an industry, by the way, that probably doesn't exist in the country to begin with. So we've got all of those kinds of issues that we discussed earlier. One is, how do you possibly know what your producer surplus will be in the future in an industry that doesn't exist? And how do you know what the loss of consumer surplus will be, or for how long that loss needs to take place? So even if you had a pretty good idea that, yes, we can compete in low-end manufactured goods in the future, if we can get started, for 5 or 10 years maybe, that'll give us enough of a bridge to really get an industry going, then perhaps we can compete on a better basis. Now, so that's one issue. I mean, just the giant uncertainty about the orders of magnitude. The other issue, a second issue, not the other, but a second issue is, will the industry actually become more competitive? There is plenty of evidence to suggest under import substituting industrialization strategies that domestic manufacturing industries did arise. There's also plenty of examples that the vast majority of those industries that arose behind tariff and other trade barrier protection were incredibly inefficient. So remember, one of the things that economists really like about competition is it forces you to be competitive. It forces you to find the most productive or most efficient ways of producing your goods and services. Otherwise, you go out of business. And so if you're operating behind trade protection, there's less competitive pressures, and that may very well mean that you also don't generate much in the way of efficiencies in your industry. And again, of course, we know that there has to be some sort of domestic market failure for this to happen, although I think the domestic market failure problem is not a big issue. The two big domestic market failures that have generally been talked about, so we talked about capital markets being inefficient and labor markets being inefficient, but from an ISI perspective, the two inefficiencies or market failures that are generally discussed are indeed the capital market side. How do we finance the development of a new industry? Most developing countries don't have bond markets. They don't have stock markets, or at least they don't have deep and liquid bond and stock markets. They may not have particularly good banking system. They undoubtedly don't have venture capitalists and angel investors and all the other kinds of ways that we can fund new industries and new ideas in the developed world. There's also a problem that we call the problem of appropriability, which I'll talk about in just a minute. The biggest problem with capital markets is financial institutions themselves. I remember a time, not that long ago, well, maybe not that long ago in my life, but maybe a long time ago in your life, when in Brazil, if you wanted to build a factory in Brazil, you could borrow long-term money. You could borrow it for exactly 7 days. That was the longest term debt instrument that traded in Brazil, 7 days. Now, how would you like to think about, let's see, we want to build a new factory and expand production. It's going to take us maybe 6 months, maybe a year and a half to actually develop this facility and get it up and running. But all that I know is what my interest rate on borrowing the money will be for the next 7 days. And then it's going to change, maybe dramatically. Sometimes interest rates over an 18-month period in Brazil back in the 1980s, where 7-day money that is, was as low as 25%. And sometimes in a 7-day period, it was as high as 250%. Try and do your project planning on that one. So needless to say, if you have underdeveloped financial markets and you can't borrow long-term, but to develop a manufacturing sector takes a long-term investment, it's just not going to happen. So this would give us a justification for having the government